listening room, the hearing room. Express yourself and have your say.
And welcome to the Woodshed Podcast. I'm Aaron Tornberg, and I'm here today with Bob Familiar. How are you doing today, Bob?
Very good, Aaron. Glad to be here.
Thanks. And we're going to talk to Bob about some really interesting stuff, a little different than what I normally have on the podcast, because Bob does electronic music and uses a modular synth. So we'll talk more about what that is. And we also want to talk about the hearing room and the fact that we have great events coming up. We have, as usual, Tuesday night open mic, 7 to 10 p.m. Let's Have Words is the spoken word open mic, 7 to 10 p.m. And we have Thursday night, the Singin' Jam. The Singin' Jam is a big group jam with words and chords put on the screen, and you can come in and just jam with the people who are here and socialize and have a great time. And then we have on Friday and Saturday nights different events. We have the Irish Jam coming up. That's the first Friday of the month. And then we have on the third Friday the Bluegrass Jam. And then we have Saturdays that vary as well. We have Performance Lab, which has things like the Modular Synth group. They come, and they were just here. And that one, it was a lot of fun. I didn't get to make it to that. But
great set of performances this past Saturday night, yes.
Yeah, so we have great events here at the Hearing Room. And then Sunday, we have a very full day. We have the Drum Circle from 12:30 to 1:30, and we have the open mic 2 to 5, and then often we have Sunday night activities, such as the Jitterbug Jam or movie night. So keep an eye on hearingroom.net for more information, and you can learn what's up at the Hearing Room. We also want to thank the Greenville Junction Shop. Greenville Junction Shop is a place to go and get repurposed items. So it's what we call upcycling. So we're upcycling all kinds of things, chairs, tables, electronics. In fact, I think that would be a good place to find modular synth equipment.
Hey, I'm going shopping. Yeah.
Right, you could. And you know, they actually do have that kind of stuff. We just saw like they had a lighting system for a specific stage lighting kit, and you know, it was cool if you need it.
I need one of those.
All right, if you do, there you go. But also, I got a MacBook Pro from them that I just fixed up a little, and it was fine. So my son now has a MacBook Pro. You know, cool stuff there. So Greenville Junction Shop is spelled Greenville, Greenville, Junction, Junktion, as in repurposed junk. And Shoppe, Shoppe, the old spelling of shop. You can find them on Facebook, and you can check out items they have on Facebook Marketplace and purchase there. So you should definitely check them out. They also have garage clean-out and estate clean-out. So if you need those services, it's another thing they offer. So check out their Facebook page. So, Bob, how you doing?
Great, Aaron.
And tell me about yourself. So where are you from?
Well, I was born in Troy, New York, grew up in South Jersey, came up to the Boston area to go to school a very long time ago, and I've been here ever since. I live in Sudbury, Massachusetts.
So you didn't go to Rensselaer, you were right there.
I was actually up until the age of 3, so I didn't really, they weren't accepting anyone at that age at that time, but I lived just down the street from...
Well, did you apply?
I didn't even try, Aaron.
Well, you should have applied, because you never know. you were a resident. You probably could have gotten
That's true.
in-town tuition or whatever. But so you grew up there, and where'd you go to school in Boston?
Well, I came up in 1977 to go to Berklee College of Music. So I started there, and I was studying jazz at the time. And I went into Berklee as a drummer. That was my first instrument, drums. And so rhythm has always been a core part of my music. But I went there. But I found when I arrived there at Berklee that, wow, there were a lot of good drummers. It was very eye-opening that, if I wanted to make a go at music, I needed to expand my horizons. And so that's where I started to focus on composition, arranging, and I studied that while at Berklee. And then after that, I actually played in bands in Boston for some time in the early 80s. I was in a band called The Dark, and several other bands there in the early 80s, and that was a blast. But that's about the time that I realized it was tough to make it in quote unquote make it in the music industry, and I also was very much interested in technology. So with some encouragement from my fiance at the time, is now my wife Mandy, she said, why don't you go take a programming course, go check it out. So that's what I did. I went and took a course in programming, and found that it was like breathing, very similar to music. Music I felt came very naturally to me, and turns out software came very naturally to me as well. And so I went back to school for computer science, and always kept the music alive, but made my living in the software industry the last 30 plus years.
Okay, and now you said you're working where?
I work at Microsoft. I'm the director of the Microsoft Technology Center in Burlington, Massachusetts.
What does that mean, a technology center?
So that's the place where Microsoft's customers come and engage my team, who are very senior architects. And they work with my team to solve some of their most challenging issues, but also what we like to call art of the possible. Come in, let's talk about your business, how you can use technology to transform what you're doing. And we're there every day. We work with customers. Minimum engagement's a full day. Sometimes a customer might be with us for 2 or 3 or 4 days. Just working on an architecture, a prototype, thinking through a business process, whatever it is.
And it sounds a lot like Modular Synth as well. You're trying to solve a problem by and add to what you're doing with technology.
Well, as we talked about before we started, there's this interesting connection between engineering and art. And that's certainly, my passions are music and engineering, and when those two things come together, you have a synthesizer, right? So, right. From my perspective, that's where I find the joy in it, and the instruments themselves are works of advanced engineering, but then you can use it to create music and create art with it. And as we were saying, there are a lot of musicians who work in the technology industry, and it's because there is that marriage between engineering and art. It's very much takes the same approach. When you architect a piece of software, you could say, well, that's kind of similar to composing a piece of music. I'm architecting the music. I'm defining the parts, the connections, the layers, the associations. That's what a software architect does, but a composer does that with music.
And just so people listening know, if you go to the Woodshed Podcast page on Facebook, there are pictures of Bob putting together the setup for tonight, so you can get a sense of what a modular synth setup looks like. It's full of wires and knobs and all kinds of stuff that I wouldn't know the first thing about right now, maybe someday, but it's pretty impressive looking, and you can check out what it looks like and hear a little video that I took of Bob tuning up. So you can check that out. So tell me about these units that you've got behind you. So you've got you've got a mixer. I recognize that part.
Right.
And then you've got a board with knobs and wires that's white, a board with knobs and wires that's black, and a lot of lights flashing on and off. And then you've got a little thing with knobs that looks like you're controlling something. So tell me what all that is.
Yeah, so these instruments, the beauty of this type of instrument, which is, you'll hear the term Eurorack. So if you go online and you search Eurorack, you'll see these types of instruments. They're made up of individual modules. So so just step back for a second. When we think about a synthesizer, what is it? Most people think of it's a keyboard instrument, right? Mm-hmm. And then above the keyboard is a panel with knobs on it. And the idea is that by turning those knobs, I can create an original sound. I can make it sound like a string. I can make it sound like a horn. I can make it sound like a laser beam. Whatever sound or effect I'm looking to do. It's working with voltage, with electricity, going through a set of components. The knobs are attenuating or modulating that current, and then that current is turned into audio on the output. And that's what you need the mixer for, so that it can be sent to a speaker and you can hear what it sounds like. Mm-hmm. So it all is about manipulating a voltage. With the instrument that might first come to mind, where you see the keyboard and the knobs behind it, that's what we refer to as a fixed architecture synthesizer. So mm-hmm. what that means is the flow of the current through that system is a fixed architecture. I can't really do much to modify that. There might be some switches I can throw that will change the direction of the signal path and so on, but there's not a whole lot I can do. A modular synthesizer like I'm using tonight says, let me take all the components that make up that synthesizer architecture and break it out into individual modules, where I can then go to many different module manufacturers and pick different components from different manufacturers. But because they've been built to a set of standards, they all work together. Mm-hmm. So I can get my filter from one manufacturer, my oscillator from another manufacturer. I can get a mixer or an attenuator or a mult. It's all these different types of modules you can get. Effects, I can get delays and reverbs and all kinds of things like that in this Eurorack format, put them in a case, and then the only way I can get them to work together is all the wires that you see. Mm-hmm. So the beauty of it is I get to decide where the current flows from one module to the other, from an output to an input. And because they are so flexible, and it makes it an extremely creative process to say, and in some cases it can be a daunting process, but it's a creative process to start with a blank slate of a machine that makes no sound whatsoever because the cables haven't been plugged in. And I'm going to now figure out what direction I want to take the sound in to create a piece of music. And so that is the beauty of the modular synthesizers. It gives you that creative outlet.
And how much of this is guesswork, and how much of this you know exactly what the sound is going to be?
Great question. I think when I started out, it was about 100% guesswork. And then over time, you get to know the instrument. You get to know each individual module, what it does, what it's really good at, what its limitations are. You find out how different modules interact with each other. Almost like, colors on a canvas, right? And so you it's like any other instrument, you learn to play it. But what's also interesting is, learning to play it within one configuration. I can unplug these modules, take them out of the case, and put different ones in, and now I have a different instrument. So what it is, it's a combination of build your own instrument, and then build your own set of sounds coming out of that instrument. So it takes it's one of these things where it's a continuous learning as well as a continuous creativity. So you have to constantly do both to really find the nice balance, because the guessing is good. Mm-hmm. I love guessing. I love chaos. I love randomness. Mm-hmm. But I also want to have a plan, right? So those two things, the balance of those two things are I think, very much within what artists do all the time.
Yeah, and that actually brings me to, something a lot of people are more familiar with who listen to the show, which is songwriting. So when you produce something, when you compose it, you're writing a song. But how do you know, what if I do this here? What if I want to change the tone into a very high pitch? Like, how do you get that tuned and figure it out as you're composing, or is it all in your head already?
Well, if I were using, there's obviously a lot of different types of electronic instruments. So if I were using, let's say something, for lack of a better term, something a little more traditional, a drum machine, a fixed architecture synth, I might have a sequencer, something like that. And a classic thing that you'll hear is, 4 on the floor bass drum, right? And then I'll get a 16 note sequence going on the synthesizer, and then maybe on another synth I'll play a lead line, right? So now I'm composing and I'm starting to create songs that have traditional structure, an A section, a B section, a verse, a chorus. And I've done music like that, and I enjoy creating music like that. Modular synthesizers, by their very nature, that you're not really 100% sure if I plug the wire from here to here, what could possibly happen. That it's every time I create a patch, it's a moment of discovery. And so it lends itself to a more experimental type of music for me, and more improvisational, like jazz. So when I'm performing a modular piece, I've set up, it's like I've created a plan, right?
Right.
But I'm not sure what's going to happen from 1 minute to the next. I have a plan about what knobs I might want to turn and things I might want to tweak. But I also might just come up with an idea like halfway through and go, oh, I wonder what happened if I turned this. And maybe I'll get a happy accident, or maybe I'll have a horrible collision. I don't know. But it's that moment of chaos or chance. It's the risk. And so the music that I'm creating with modular tends to be more free-form, ambient, experimental. For, again, the terminology, for me, it's not experimental. For me, it's normal. But other people might listen to it and go, "Why, that's really weird stuff," right?
Yeah.
Some people call it bleeps and bloops, but it's for me, it's expanded the definition of what music is. So I still love musical form, and people who are really good at it are amazing. I listen to Paul Simon all day long, and
Right.
Amazing songwriter. But I also like to listen to music that is that might go on for 20 minutes and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of changing there. Like we have the drone evenings at the hearing room, right?
Right.
And people come and it could be 3 hours of musical droning, and you're like, well, where's the form? Where's it changing? But it's really about just being in the moment and hearing the layers and the relationship between the tones and enjoying the music at that at that level, and saying I'm gonna eschew form. I don't care about verse and chorus. I just want to have a sonic experience, and that's where these instruments tend to take you.
Yeah, and I found that, the first time I went to the drone, I really enjoyed it because it's sort of zen.
Yes.
It's like you let the sound wash over you, and it's overwhelming when you come in. If you come in and you don't know what you're looking at, you're going to probably walk out quickly. Yes. But if you understand what this is and participate, it's the participation that's fun. Because I was twisting all kinds of knobs, and I had some apps on my phone that were drone related, and they simulate these things. I think it's a lot of fun, but it is jarring. It's a different experience than songwriting, I know it.
It's like anything in life. You have to walk into something strange, and you go, I'm gonna just give this a chance. I'm going to remain curious. I'm going to try to understand, rather than walking away and just saying that's horrible. It's just noise. It's like, no, give it a minute. And you will find in there a musical element. And if you kind of lock onto that, and then everything else is background or is now supporting that, whatever musical element you happen to lock in on as you were listening, I think it's a more active listening. As you said, you're participating, whether you're even performing or not. As a listener, you need to participate as well. You need to open your mind and say, I'm going to accept this in. I'm going to try to understand it. It has a form that I'm not familiar with, that I'm not hearing where the one is. I don't know where the beat is. I'm not hearing chord changes. So what else, what else can I lock onto and try to, make sense of? So that's where I think this type of music takes you. At the same time, I sometimes create music with these machines, which is more in the realm of, has form to it, has sections to it, and there is a beat. And so that's another reason I really love the electronic instruments, is I can go in any one of those directions and enjoy it.
Well, I found what I grabbed onto, and this might make sense to you because you were a drummer to start out, is the rhythms are what comes through all the drone.
Yes.
And so if you get, a good drum sound just going or something like that, that's where you go, oh, okay, that's something. That's a steady tone, and that does something. And then when it changes, it's kind of, it can either change in a jarring way, or it can change in a gentle way where it starts to slowly get slower. And
It's exactly it. Exactly. The rhythm is a great bit of glue in a lot of these pieces, for sure. And what the modular synthesizers allow you to do is since everything is about voltage, it's electricity. So it begins with that. And what you're deciding when you run a cable from one module to another is that I'm going to take the voltage signal that's coming out of this, the electrical signal, and send it into this other. Now, what's happening is those voltages will typically run anywhere from a negative 5 volts to a positive 5, or 0 to 10. Those are the typical ranges. And then there are the knobs attenuate that. So it might say, well, I want the voltage to come out of this out and go to this in port. By default, it's coming out at plus 10, but I'm going to dial it back to plus 5. And now I'm affecting the flow of the current from one module to the other. Many times what you're controlling also are things called triggers and gates. And these triggers and gates are what create the rhythm that you use. So you might use those as pulses from one module to another to trigger an envelope, or to ping a filter, or create the drum sound that you're trying to say is sort of the centerpiece of the composition.
Mm-hmm. I'd say I hunt and peck. That's how I best describe the way I do that. Because you're talking like you actually know what the things are. For me, it's a bunch of dials, and I turn one and it goes and then if I turn it the other way, it goes So for me, it's just, let's see what this knob does. And then if I combine it with this knob, what does that do?
Yes.
But you've got a little different because you've got these modules you built. For me, I had like one unit that was already constructed. So
Right.
I'm just, somebody else made it and I'm guessing.
Well, I want to be clear. Someone else made all these modules. I just picked the ones I wanted and put them in the case. So,
Right.
But the great point, there is also a huge community of DIY folks in modular that you can actually go buy kits and solder them together yourself, which I have tried to do.
Yeah.
And I think Mandy is listening, so I don't know if she knows this, but I'm batting about 500 on my ability to put a module together. So half of them that I've bought and tried to put together are failures, and half of them work. And that was a good learning experience to basically say, maybe soldering I should leave to somebody else. And that, but it was fun to try, and that's another big part of this is learning the electronics behind a lot of these components.
Yeah, and with other musicians, you're putting your effort into this, but if I buy a new guitar because the sound is different, it's the same idea. You're just trying to use your tools.
Exactly.
And so I get that. And sometimes I buy an auto harp and I didn't enjoy it, and now I've got an auto harp and I don't need one.
Yeah.
But it's
and there are a lot on eBay. So
yeah.
So now it's going to be hard to sell.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to sell them, especially since it needs new strings. But so when you perform, you're basically making educated guesses as to what's going to happen, and you practice the piece.
Yes, when we wire up one of these instruments, what we call it is a patch, right? So I've patched the synthesizer. That's where that term comes from, because this style of synthesis is not new. This has been around since, you can go back to the 50s and 60s, and that's where the, Bob Moog and Dan Buchla, these creators of modular synthesis, they were creating instruments for composers, and they had walls and walls of these huge modules, and they were running giant cables from one to the other. It looked like a old telephone patch bay, right?
That's what it looks like.
And it's the same idea. You're running voltage from one place to the other, same idea. But what has occurred over the last probably about 10 years or so is that the Eurorack industry grew up because there was a desire to get out of the computer, because everyone was creating music in what's called in the box, right? On your Mac or on your PC. And everything you did was on the computer. Mm-hmm. All the drums were there. All the loops were there. Everyone was working what they call a DAW, or digital audio workstation. And people were looking for a way to sort of escape the box, and hardware is the way to do that. So they created a new format called Eurorack. It was defined by a gentleman by the name of Dofer.
So can you spell that?
Dofer?
No, Eurorack.
Eurorack is EURORACK.
Okay, it's like
Euro. Yeah,
okay.
like the currency.
Just wanted to make sure.
And it's important, that currency is actually part of the name, a type of currency, because it's not it's an expensive endeavor. So sometimes they call it Eurocrack, but it's it can be an expensive endeavor diving into this. But what happened is a whole industry spawned, and so a lot of these module makers are small, few people in a garage, to company that I like their modules, Make Noise. They might have 20 employees. 25 employees max. Yeah. Small companies producing these modules, and then being able to then go online and sort of, as I said, go and do your shopping and create your own instrument based on doing all your research.
Now, do companies like Roland and Moog and those people, they create modules as well? They
have their own line. If you on Moog, who I'm a fan of, their modules are the old school modules, a different size. They're not Eurorack format. Mm-hmm. So if you go with Moog modular, it's that's what's referred to as a 5U size. All their modules are 5 server rack units high. That's the measurement when they say 5U. If you're familiar with servers in a server room, data center, right? Imagine that, and there's servers in a rack. Each time there's a 1 unit, it's about an inch or an inch and a half high. That's a unit. Mm-hmm. 5 of those high. That's how tall their modules are from Moog.
Okay.
These are 3U. The Eurorack is a 3U size. And you can see in these instruments, I have 2 rows of 3U modules in this rack, in this suitcase right here. Same over here, except this one has a mult down the middle, has a special centerpiece. But the Moog has theirs, and guess what? Theirs are incredibly expensive. So if you want to get a Moog modular, they are beautiful sounding. But they'll start in the $15,000 to $35,000 range, and go up from there for a small set of components. And Roland actually has come out with some Eurorack modules, and they're priced just like all the other Eurorack modules, and so they're a little more accessible, and they're quite good as well. So Roland, being a very Japanese, very good synthesizer company, has some very quality modules. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Eurorack module manufacturers.
That's great.
It's a huge industry in the sense that you've got a lot of players, and some small, some medium, some big. It's interesting.
Well, I want to talk more about that a little later. about getting into this. But before it gets to be the middle of the show, I'd like to play your one piece now.
Okay.
And then we can play the other later. So what are we about to hear?
So I'm going to play a piece that's going to really at the center, it's just about four modules altogether that are being used. One is going to sound like a guitar. And so you're going to say, wow, that when you hear it, that sounds like a guitar, but it's doing a type of synthesis called physical modeling. So it sounds like a string being plucked. The bass part will be done with an analog module. And so, and it will, I've made it so it sounds like a bass guitar. But so now I'm using these electronic instruments, but I think they'll have a bit more of a electric guitar, electric bass tonality to it. But then I'm going to mix in some weird electronics on top of that and some delay. So that we'll play with that a little bit. All right.
Okay. Well, let's hear it. So this is Bob Familiar, and he's going to be playing the modular synth he brought with him, and let's see how it sounds. That was cool.
Thank you.
So, do you have a name for it?
Yes. That one is called Deja Vu.
Okay.
That's the working title anyway. So I'm working on a series of ambient pieces under the working title of, oh gosh, I'm going to forget. Hold on one second. I'll look it up. You were quizzing me.
Well, not on purpose.
So, so the working title is Apparitions. And that one's called Deja Vu.
So you practice that and you can reproduce pretty much the same piece each time?
Yes. So we exchanged email this weekend, and I did a performance Saturday night, but I wanted to do something different for this show. So I, before the Patriots came on yesterday, I worked really, really hard and came up with these two pieces. And then, so then the act of composing it, patching it and figuring out what I'm going to do, probably, a couple of hours of work there. And then I write down notes about what my plan of action is, and if I have to remember to recable anything, I keep a little notebook, and then shut everything off and hope when I go and turn it back on, it still works. As you noted when we got started, I had to let it warm up because a lot of the components are analog, so they take some time to the circuitry to warm up and get in tune, and stay in tune.
You're using 1/8" cables, basically.
Yes, they're all equivalent to an 1/8" mono cable, and so when you go and get into Eurorack and you choose your modules, there's one of the accessories you'll need. You'll need cables. So and usually they come color coded, which is handy, so that okay, I'm going to use this color for this path and this color for this other path and things of that sort.
So let's say I'm a beginning modular synth fanatic, or fan, whichever word you prefer.
Yeah.
And I want to start, but I don't have much money. So I'm going to go with the least expensive way to get my feet wet. What would I go by?
I think a good place to start is what is called it's a semi-modular. So a synthesizer, and there are several of them out there. You can get the Moog Mother 32. You can get the Arturia Mini Brute 2. Behringer has the Neutron. So there are different manufacturers that make what are called a semi-modular, and it's semi-modular in that it has a patch bay on it usually. So they've taken all the patch points and put them onto one side of the synthesizer, creating a grid of inputs and outputs. And then the other part of the synth has all the knobs on it. So the idea is that if you were to turn it on, plug a cable in that goes to your speaker, you don't have to patch anything. There's a fixed architecture there. And then it gives you the patch bay to break the fixed architecture circuit path and learn what patching does. What if I were to, patch the LFO to a different location that's not available by turning the knobs? The only way to get it to happen is if I run the cable from one port to another. So it gives you a way to learn the act of doing modular synthesis with a synthesizer that will work even if you don't do that.
So how much is something like that?
They can run anywhere from a couple $100 to $1,000 or more. I mean, the price range is very broad for a lot of these instruments. A fixed architecture and semi-modular, I think there's a lot of reasonably priced instruments out there. When you jump over to Eurorack, you're making a commitment that you have to get several modules in order to get, a basic synth path. You probably want to get an oscillator. You might want to get a filter. And so there might be 4 or 5 modules sort of in a minimal configuration that you'd want to get. Again, there are different manufacturers at different price points. there's one manufacturer, 2HP. Every module they make is very thin. And so, and they each run like $100 to $120. So you could get your 4 or 5 modules from 2HP, and it'll fit in a very small space, and you could learn to work with those modules. Over time, you might find them to be physically too small to work with. So maybe you want to go with a format that's more like what I have on display here, where each module's a couple inches to 4 or 5 inches across with big knobs. And so if you've got fat fingers like I got, and you want to dive in there and turn knobs, you're not banging a knob you didn't mean to.
How often do you buy a new module?
Oh, I'm not allowed to say that on air. I think Mandy's listening.
How often do you want to buy a new module?
So it's, to be quite honest, I think I'm pretty done. And I've been, researching and buying modules and also selling modules. So I've bought modules, I've used them for a while, and I've sold them online. And there's a very active synth community that's interested in buying and selling gear. So that hasn't really been an issue. So I'd say I've been doing it for about 3 years, and I think I have the instruments that I want at this point.
Okay.
But it's taken me a while of sort of trial and error with some modules. Like I got a module, it's like, wow, this didn't really do what I had hoped. And so you either return it if it's within time, or you sell it if you've had it for a couple of months. But the modules that I've landed on here, I'm very happy with, and I have a combination of digital and analog modules. And there are some folks who are pure analog, and that's all they do, and some people are pure digital. But I like, for me, it's whatever does the job. They all sound amazing.
So for those of you who are guitarists, you know how we sometimes like to retune to a detuning or something like that. Well, while I talk about the hearing room and do a little ad for the Greenville Junction Shop, Bob is going to tune to D, basically, except he's going to do it in modular synth terms and repatch a bunch of stuff. So, meanwhile, I wanted to talk about how you should become a member of the hearing room. It's $100 a year, and what you get out of that is you get to support the hearing room and become a part of the community. You also get $5 off on all events, and a lot of the events that are collaborative are often $5 as it is, so you'd get in for nothing if you're a member. You would also get a t-shirt and a membership card, and you get the satisfaction of becoming part of the community. And we also are always looking for volunteers who want to do things here, like run the door or help with an event. I know that we're looking at doing live broadcast from the hearing room as well, and we're going to need a lot of support for that. So if you're interested in being involved with the hearing room and becoming a member, you should definitely do that. And more information can be found at hearingroom.net, as well as our Facebook page, which is listed under the hearing room. So please check that out. Also, we want to thank the Greenville Junction Shop. That's Greenville, Greenville, Junction, Junktion, Shoppe, Shoppe. And the Greenville Junction Shop is a great place to find upcycled items that you may want. It's not necessarily important to buy new. You can buy upcycled things that are perfectly good and can suit your needs, especially when you think about furniture and books and things like that that are perfectly good items that people just tend to get rid of for various reasons. So if you want to find these treasures, you should go to the Greenville Junction Shop on Facebook, and you should also check out their services of estate cleanout and garage cleanout. So Greenville Junction Shop is on Facebook, and you're able to look at it anytime. And today we're talking with Bob Familiar, and Bob is talking about modular synth. And Bob, I wanted to ask, what is sort of the history of this? Because I know that essentially, my understanding is we wouldn't have any of the computerized sound like iPods or anything like that without some of this. Is that true? Is that a good assessment?
Well, certainly, like, the evolution of technology is, in a lot of cases, it's all related, right? From vacuum tubes to transistors, all that, miniaturization. The same thing's been happening with instruments. You think about the evolution of the electric guitar. Technology is always moving forward, and musicians are always finding ways. Musicians and engineers actually working together are finding ways to leverage the technology to advance their craft. And that was certainly, as I said, I think that there was a big surge in interest from mainly classical composers. You think about people like Morton Subotnick in the 60s, who was very influential, worked with Buchla to help define that set of instruments that is sometimes referred to as West Coast synthesis because it was happening over on the West Coast of the U.S. And then Bob Moog here, who lived on the East Coast, and his style of synthesizer instruments are sometimes referred to as East Coast. So there was this East Coast, West Coast approach, two different approaches to synthesis, where Bob Moog's approach is subtractive. Dan Buchla's is more of an additive approach. So they were coming at it from different angles, using different approaches of the technology. Both fantastic applications and great instruments, but appealed to different musicians. So all that was happening. And where it really took off and, let's say, became mainstream, if we kind of want to focus in on there, is Bob Moog was creating these modular synthesizers, and you might recall Switched on Bach. So
right.
Wendy Carlos, and that was a huge hit, and really made synthesizers like a household term, right? And it was then mainstream. My goodness, it's doing classical music, right? And I can remember as a kid that getting all kinds of press back then. It was very cool. Well, Bob Moog created those instruments that are used on that album, and what he did is, he was working with professional musicians, and they were saying, could you put, at the end of the day, you need some way to control these synthesizers, either metal plates or some kind, or turning the knobs. If you want to do something physical, they have metal plates you can put your fingers on. I have examples of that on this instrument over here, and I can affect voltages flowing by touching the plates. That's called a controller. Well, the professional musicians said, I want to control it with something I know how to play. How about like a keyboard? So Bob Moog put a keyboard on his synthesizer, and that was the Mini Moog. And it's one of the most popular, and now these days, since they don't make them anymore, sought after instruments. Was the Mini Moog. And then other synth manufacturers came around. Massachusetts-based ARP came out with the ARP Odyssey and other ARP instruments, and these were now being adopted by Herbie Hancock and rock musicians and jazz musicians, and they were showing up in popular music. And then the keyboard manufacturers came in and just started mass manufacturing, and that was the birth of Yamaha and Roland, and these big companies came in, and that was the birth then of new wave music. And the band I was in, I was the synthesizer keyboard player. That was the thing, it was dance music, and then that evolved into rap with drum machines and sampling, and that was the evolution of the technology. And then everyone was brought all that into the computer, and in the 90s, basically you had everyone doing quote unquote electronic music, but they were doing it with virtual instruments and with the laptop, and that's still a popular way to do it today. And those instruments sound amazing, right? But they're all software. It's 100% software based. Mm-hmm. About 10 years ago, there was this desire for people to get out of the DAW. They call it going DAWless. And I discovered that about 3 years ago because I was working in a DAW and it was getting frustrating because every track, it was like mouse, keyboard, screen.
And DAW, define that again.
That's a digital audio workstation piece of software like Cakewalk or Reaper or, Ableton. These are that's a very popular one. So these are the pieces of software that you create your tracks. Right? You have individual tracks and you can mix them and then create your final piece of music. People are saying, I want to create music, but I want to get out of I use a laptop or a computer all day at work. I don't want to then use it for my creativity.
Right.
So now there was this rebirth of hardware, and now there are just, whether it's hardware synthesizers, hardware drum machines, hardware sequencers, hardware samplers, Eurorack modules. This is all this rebirth of hardware that you can physically touch. And for me, getting out of the computer and using these machines to create music's made me much more productive. It's a much more creative process. And it fits the kind of music I like to make, which in that first piece, I was improvising a little bit in there, and improvising in the terms I wasn't making the notes. The notes, I programmed the modules to generate notes of a certain type and certain rhythms. But I was turning the knobs and affecting the music as it went, the speed, how many notes are being played, the tonality of the filters being applied, how much delay is in there. All these things I was modifying. So from that sense, that was my performing with the machine, creating that music in that moment. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot like jazz. It's, jazz has form and has some structure, but at the same time, all those musicians are just, they're listening and improvising as they go.
And as you have done this, what did you start out with, like in the 80s? So, you were on synth, but obviously you didn't do this.
No, at that time I had a couple of Moog instruments. I had an instrument called a Memory Moog, which was a 6-voice polyphonic synthesizer from Moog, which means I could play chords on it. Mm-hmm. And then I had a Multi-Moog, which was a monophonic synthesizer. It could play one note, and that was used for lead lines. So I could do chords, I could do lead lines. And so the Multi-Moog had no memory, so every time I wanted to change the sound, I was turning knobs to generate the next sound there. Mm-hmm. The Memory Moog actually had memory, so I could store up to 100 different patches. And so if I were performing live, I could just say, well, this song I'm going to use these 3 sounds. The next song, so I would put them in the order that I needed them for the set, right? So that was the way that I was performing back then, and that was in a band with. The songs all had form and structure, and I had specific parts I was going to play for the whole set. Where this is much more like when I sit down with sort of the blank canvas of these, it's like painting a picture. I'm saying, right. What do I want to paint today? I think I'll do a landscape, and I'd start running the cables and try to create a sonic scene, a moment that is sonically enjoyable. And hopefully transports the listener to, in their own mind, to someplace pleasing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's come a long way from what I remember as doing music on computer, which was, I think the first time I ever did it was on an Apple IIe. They had this software where you could record about 3 seconds of a cassette, and it would convert it into a whole disc full, and it would play like, at the time, Twisted Sister, I Wanna Rock. Right. So like the thing would load up on the floppy disk, and it would be, I Wanna Rock, and it would be really crunchy, sounds terrible. I mean, the speaker in there was not a real speaker. I mean, it was it was all just computer beeps mostly. But then, all of a sudden everybody's doing digital sound. So how did that happen that it goes from this sort of kind of thing that you're doing on the Apple IIe, where it's really just electricity going through, I think, on the IIe software, and then becomes something so smooth, and I can record the podcast on my laptop.
So back then, and I was using an Atari 1040 ST, by the way. So
Okay.
same idea, right? The computers of the 80s, and they just had very lo-fi, audio capability, and dealing with the representation of information was maximum 8 bits. So what's interesting today is, there's a whole movement of musicians who seek out those 8-bit sounds, and they compose music as lo-fi, and that's a whole genre unto itself, and it can be pretty entertaining and pretty cool. Right. But today we're dealing now with the ability, when I record at home, I'm recording at 196 kilohertz. Which means whatever is happening, I'm getting the full frequency spectrum recorded with that and into a 32-bit WAV file. So I've captured as much information. It's digital at that point because now it's sitting on a hard drive. Mm-hmm. But I've captured enough resolution of that audio so that as I go and I process it and I eventually produce a 16-bit file that's playable on as a WAV file or eventually an MP3 or send it up to a streaming site, it's as high quality as I can get it in that domain, right? Mm-hmm. Still, for me, it's most enjoyable when it's live because I'm hearing these machines through, some high fidelity speakers, and they're warm and the sound, as you put it, the sound envelops you, and it's very enjoyable. And so to get it to a point though where it sounds as good as it can possibly sound, that's kind of my process right now. Is I create a piece live and then I record it to the computer. Mm-hmm. As I just performed it earlier. I did that yesterday, and I recorded it live, and I have that now captured. And when my next album comes out, it'll be that'll be one of the tracks. But it's what I performed yesterday at home, and I recorded it.
And what's your website?
So you can find me on all the streaming sites. If you search Bob Familiar, mm-hmm. you will find me. I'm the only one.
Okay.
So far, unless my son gets into the game.
Is he Bob as well?
He goes by Robert, so he's Robert, and I'm Bob. So I'll be Bob Familiar on Spotify or iTunes, Apple Music, any of those. Mm-hmm. But also I have a Bandcamp site, so that's Bob Familiar, one word, .bandcamp.com.
Okay,
and all my albums are there as well.
And how often do you record an album typically?
Just to give you a sense, when I was working, I've always been working a full-time job and doing this in my copious spare time, right? Mm-hmm. So it's the passion. When I was working on a computer and creating music, it would take me a year to create about 10 tracks. So an mm-hmm. album a year. I've done 11 albums in the last 3 years.
Wow.
Going all hardware. It's that much more productive. Mm-hmm. Because I can get to the finished arrangement, the finished composition, totally outside the computer. I'm hearing all the instruments working together, coordinated the way I want them, synchronized, sequenced. Mm-hmm. And I go, that sounds good. And then when I record it, I can record as the instruments are doing their thing and I'm interacting with them and doing my role in the composition.
Right.
I'm recording all of those to separate tracks on the computer. So the last mile is I take all the instruments I used, all the different sound sources as separate tracks. I mix them so I can EQ each one individually. I can choose the loudness of each of those tracks, mix it to its final form, and then master it, which means just raising the volume and final EQ and compression to get it so that it's at the level that you can push it to a streaming site.
What are you using for software to record?
I'm using, so the first piece is I actually have a piece of hardware that handles the translation from the analog signal to the digital. And that's I use a PreSonus Studio Live 32 channel board. It's also my audio interface. So it will, and it uses FireWire to the PC. So as all the instruments are going in, let's say I'm recording 6 tracks on my board. Those 6 individual tracks are now going over the FireWire live and becoming WAV files on the PC in real time. I then take those WAV files and I bring them into Cakewalk. So Cakewalk is a free digital audio workstation software from a company called BandLab, and you can just download it for free. And I pop them into that, and then I EQ each track to taste, choose if I want to mix it left, right, if I want to automate something about the mix, one thing moves from the left to the right over time or something like that. I'll do any of that work in this piece of software, but that usually now goes incredibly fast. So instead of spending 10 months of copious spare time on a computer, I'm spending the last 2 hours of the process in the computer to get to finished product. So the output is just that much more, which means I can keep moving forward in my creative process. I can keep trying things, keep experimenting. I'm not getting bogged down on that one song I've been working on for 7 months. It's like, no. Get to done. Create the piece of music, create the moment, perform it, capture the performance, and release it. That's been a much more enjoyable process for me.
Okay. We had talked a little about the fact there's an extensive history of electronic music. But one thing that's fascinating to me is the theremin, which has been around a long time. Can you tell me about how that plays into it? Was that like an early electronic instrument?
It was, and I'm going to forget who the inventor of the theremin is, but it's interestingly enough, it's Bob Moog who popularized it.
Okay.
So he took it, and you'll actually can go on YouTube. You can find videos of Bob Moog demonstrating the theremin on late night TV in the the 40s and 50s. So Bob Moog was, at that point using it to make a name for himself, and he was manufacturing theremins, and that then it turned into him manufacturing synthesizers. So it was like that's how Bob Moog started, and the whole Moog music phenomena, interesting enough, was born out of the theremin. And so, and that is an instrument that has a couple of, antennas coming off of it. Right. And one goes left to right, one goes up and down. And then as you move your hand near the antenna, you're interrupting the magnetic field, and that then is translated into notes so pitch and volume.
Mm-hmm. And then you end up with the Star Trek original theme.
Right. There is, I want to say her name is Carol. I believe it's Carolyn Glick. She is she's a virtuoso. So if you could look her up, maybe after
Glick, yeah.
I'll send you a link and you can put it on the website. If anyone wants to hear a virtuoso play the theremin, she is amazing. She's like, she can play it like a first violinist of any orchestra. That level of quality and capability.
Well, but was that the first electronic instrument, or was there stuff before that?
There was stuff before that. I think, again, I'm not a historian, but I believe built for the World's Fair, I want to say before the turn of the century, and it was in New York. Again, I might get the year wrong. There was an instrument called the telharmonic. And this instrument took up like an entire floor of a building. Wow. And interestingly enough, Make Noise, who creates these modules over here, has a module called the telharmonic, which now is... where is it actually? Right, it's right here. So this module right here is a telharmonic, which gives me now the equivalent of what that instrument did, and it sits in these this 3-inch socket right here as a component. Yeah. But that the idea there was, and again I don't know the mechanics behind it, but it was a series of like turning plates and magnetism to be able to generate tones. Mm-hmm. And it could generate up to 3 tones, but it took an entire room of machinery to do this.
Right.
But it was, I think, considered one of the early synthesizers. And then electronic instruments such as just, you think about Wurlitzer organs.
Right.
Those are synthesizers.
Right.
You think about, I have a Wurlitzer organ. It's using electricity to generate those notes. And then I have the sliders to change the tone. Mm-hmm. So, electronic instruments have been around and been used and been popular for well over 100 years, probably, closer to 120 at this point.
Right.
And right now, we are the beneficiary of living in a time where you can actually access some really powerful instruments for not a lot of money. And
the other experience I had with electronic music that was significant was the Pink Floyd stuff. And where did they get the idea to do all that? Do you know if they were into this kind of thing, or it's just something they came across by accident?
There were synthesizer manufacturers that were sprouting up during that time because there was this need for professional musicians to have instruments that they could also use in the studio, but then take and play live. Mm-hmm. The case of, Pink Floyd, they were creating these albums, but then they would want to go on tour. You have Keith Emerson with Emerson, Lake and Palmer, who was, traveling with a Moog synthesizer that he was playing as well as organ and piano. He had a whole setup. But there, again, I won't recall the name of the manufacturer, but they were using a synthesizer manufactured by a UK company that created those the sounds that they used, and then the Beatles were using they may have been using an ARP or a Moog, I don't recall, but if you they were using synthesizer on several of their songs.
Right.
If you think about Maxwell's Silver Hammer as an example.
Right. And, they also use the different recordings, like on Revolution number 9.
Yeah, so that bleeds over into other uses of electronics like tape music, right? So using tape loops and slicing tape. And again, there are Eurorack modules that emulate doing that with audio. And so one module I have is called Morphogene. And the whole idea behind the Morphogene is I take an audio recording, which can be up to 2 minutes in length. So imagine that used to be on tape, and I'd have to have tape machines, and I might have to splice the tape and get the tape to loop around and keep playing against a playhead while I might be manipulating it in other ways. Well, the Morphogene allows me to take a 2-minute recording and in essence slice it up into what are called genes. So I can choose splice points by turning the knobs or through control voltages, and essentially in real time be splicing the tape and having the tape play over itself, do sound on sound. And so the instruments we have today are so powerful, and all the ideas that we're finding in these instruments, again, a lot of them aren't new. They're simply now the automated electronic version of what someone figured out to do manually 50, 60 years ago. Right.
And I have a loop pedal now that is 3 hours of recording time.
There you go.
And I can just, play a couple minute lick, and then I can play on my own and be a one-man band with the loop pedal.
And if you are a guitar player with a lot of pedals, guess what those pedals are?
They're
a synthesizer. Yeah. Those pedals all together are essentially a modular synthesizer. You're running your voltages, your signals from one to the other, and each pedal does something different.
Right.
And one's a filter, one's a compressor, one's a delay, one's reverb, one's a looper. It's the same idea. It's what format do you want it in? Do you want it on the floor in front of you? Do you want it on a stand on a table?
Yeah, pedal boards are real popular, because they have these giant boards and they just keep stacking the pedals and patching them all together. And
it's the same idea.
Yeah, and it's very interesting to get into this field, I imagine. But I was thinking getting the setup is a little bit expensive, but you said for a couple $100 basically
to get an instrument. Yeah. And I think a good place to start. I mean, I would look at, I think the Moog Mother 32 is a very good start. I think the Behringer Neutron, the Arturia Mini Brute 2, and there are several others. So if you go to, online stores like Perfect Circuit or Sweetwater, those are good sources for what synthesizers are available out there. They'll have an entire section on their website devoted to all the different types of synthesizers. So you'll find fixed architecture synthesizers. You buy the synth that has all the knobs on it, has a keyboard, I can play it, it has memory, I can make a patch, I can save it, right? Those are very useful. You won't need any of the patch cables because that's not what that synth is about. It's going to have the fixed architecture. Then you'll find these semi-modular, and they're like that, but they have a patch bay. They usually do not come with a keyboard, so that's the interesting part. You'll need some kind of a keyboard controller with that. Arturia makes a great one, which is about $100 or a little bit over, called a key step. So you get the Arturia key step, which is a small keyboard, but it has the modular outputs on the back to be able to patch it in and control. So now I can play keys and I can play the notes on this semi-modular synth. Beautiful. Now I've got two pieces of equipment that are reusable.
And what is MIDI?
So MIDI is musical instrument digital interface, MIDI. Okay. And it's an industry standard, and just about every instrument supports it. You'll do MIDI over a five pin DIN cable or USB, and in some cases that USB can be it comes in different shapes and sizes, as we all know. You have to make sure you have the right adapter.
Right.
But what it allows you to do is, typical scenario is control your hardware synths from your digital audio workstation, so you can create MIDI tracks and have capture what notes you want to play, be triggered to another instrument, record those notes, and then as the DAW is playing back, it's sending that note information to some other synthesizer. So that's one way. Or you might have a synthesizer that has a keyboard, and as you play, you're capturing that MIDI information and again recording it to your computer, so when your computer plays it back, it'll now play back what you just played. It's kind of like a player piano concept, right?
Right.
It's like record the notes, record how long I held each note, how hard I hit each note. It records all that detail, all the metadata about each of the notes you played, and then you can send that back to the instrument that generated it or to some other instrument. So that's the power of it. Or it certainly is a way we would work with drum machines as well. Sometimes you just capture the rhythm portion.
So why don't we hear your other piece that you prepared for today? And what are we about to hear?
We're about to hear Ignis Fautus. And then I will let the listeners look that up.
Okay.
Ignis Fautus.
Okay. And this is Bob Familiar doing Ignis Fautus, modular synth performer.
Thank you.
So that's Ignis Fautus is IGNIS?
IGNUS.
NUS.
FATUUS.
Oh, because this says IGNIS, but it's, shall we define it?
Go for it.
Well, here's what it says. It's a light that sometimes appears in the night over marshy ground and is often attributable to the combustion of gas from decomposed organic matter. Is that the one you meant, or is it a deceptive goal or hope?
I think that the gas, I think, is fitting. I don't. It's. I think when I was looking up the definition, I stopped at it's the light, and I said, "Oh, the light. Okay, the light in the. Okay, that works for me. The light in the fog, in the mist."
Yeah,
I
but
didn't
it's,
read about the gas part. So
well, it also says foolish fire.
There you
That's
go.
what it means. So
yeah.
What I liked about that in particular was the part you had a sound there where it was like a cell door closing almost, like metal on metal.
Yes.
And it sounded like a jail door. Is that what you intended, or?
Yeah, so the sound, it's almost like either a big spring or any type of piece of metal. Sometimes when you're moving a piece of metal and it gets that warp tone to it, being able to create that type of a sound and go, I want to incorporate that into a piece of music. And for me, that's the aspect of this kind of music that I'm drawn to, is that I can incorporate an element that you wouldn't think that's a musical element, but as you go through life, a lot of times for myself, I'll hear sounds like that, and I'll be like, for me, it's music. I'm hearing the musical quality of whatever it is, and then to be able to pull it into a piece of music where it works, hopefully it works. Because I also had that, kind of mallet rhythm going, which was not a normal rhythm, but it was it was basically two beats that were oscillating. They would get very close together and meet, and then they'd spread apart again, and then they'd come back and they'd meet again. So those two things were oscillating, and then that metal tone was itself oscillating up and down, and then on top of that, just sort of these flute and oboe type of sounds.
Now, were you looking for that sound, or did you accidentally hit upon it and go, oh, that's really cool?
Yes. That's how it works. It's you experiment with these modules and you discover, wow, if I send a voltage into this and I modulate this, if you look at the panels of these modules, there's typically a knob, and next to it is an input jack. Mm-hmm. And so you can set the knob and you'll get a value. But if I run a voltage into that, that's a voltage that's oscillating up and down, let's say like a sine wave, it's as if I'm turning that knob. So instead of me sitting there and turning the knob, I can send a control voltage into that, and it could either go and oscillate that or modulate it at an incredibly slow rate that I am just humanly, I'm not going to be that patient,
right,
or an incredibly fast rate that's humanly impossible, and everything in between. So that's the interesting part with synthesizers. Is a part of it is understanding what generates the tones, and then the other part is how can I modulate it. And so that was done with a reverb, by the way.
Yeah.
So I'm sending a pulse into the reverb, but then I'm modulating various aspects of that reverb such that it starts to sound like you're in a giant metal tank, and you're bending and twisting metal.
Yeah, it sounds great.
Yeah, thank you.
So usually I ask people to expound upon advice they'd give to other people who are musicians. I think you have a specific set. So what advice would you give to somebody who wants to start with this hobby of doing modular synth?
I would say start small and watch. What I did is I got started. I watched probably for about 6 months. All I did was watch YouTube videos. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of great information out there from experts in this field. And whether it's, if you want to look up someone by the name of DivKid, DivKid on YouTube, does modular tutorials, explains modules. Mylar Melodies. There's many artists and educators on YouTube who are helping you understand what the scope of all this is and what each module does. So I spent about 6 months just getting educated and then made a move, right? And I'd say when you make your move, start small. And the semi-modular instrument is probably a good starting point. But if you jump into Eurorack, there's a couple of ways you can go. You can actually get a Eurorack instrument, which was the first thing I did, which is this suitcase-sized thing right here is from one company. They make all the modules. Okay. So I bought that as one piece. So in other words, they thought it out already. Here are the things you need to get done. Comes in a package. It's a fairly expensive way to get started, but I had everything. Then the next thing I did is I did further research and started to put together my own suitcase-sized instrument of modules from different manufacturers, and that's what this second suitcase is. Okay. So I've got one, which is one approach, go and buy the whole thing finished already for me, so I won't make any big mistakes, right? Right. And I have a very high-quality instrument, a real true keepsake. That's the way I look at this. This is a keepsake instrument here. And this is as well, but I put it together one module at a time. I said, here's the clock I want, here's the oscillator I want, here's the filters I want, etc. And went through that process. And over time, trial and error, landed on what I have today. So I've used both those approaches. So, but like I said, an instrument of if you post a picture of these, an instrument of this size is probably going to run you, $4,000 or $5,000 when you sort of put it all together. So that's why I say start small, right, and figure out what you want step by step.
And watch videos.
Start with getting educated.
Yeah.
There's another site called modulargrid.net. And if you go there, you can actually put an instrument together on the web page, drag and drop the modules and fit them into a case of whatever size you define. And that's another great way to get educated, because then when you're done, it will tell you, here's how much power each of these modules require. So you have to make sure whatever case you put them in has the right power supply. Oh, and by the way, here's what the estimated cost of this will be. Right. So it's another way just to get educated. And you can look at other people's racks. You can look at their instruments and go, how did they do it? Right. What choices did they make? And it's one of these areas where everyone is different. Everyone has a different approach to the instrument they're putting together, and it's unique to them. And that's sort of another special attribute of it.
That's great. So thank you for being with us and explaining all this stuff. It was great. And where can people see you next if they wanted to experience this?
Well, I can say I'm part of a group called Boston Modular, and that group meets just about every month. I think we're getting together in December. So if you go to meetup.com and look up Boston Modular, you'll see about those meetups. We organize a large synthesizer festival every 6 months. We just did one back in September. The next one's in April. It's going to be April 4th. 2020 is the next big synth fest. We typically get about 250 to 300 people come through. It runs from noon till 6 on a Saturday. And we have performances all day. We have lectures going on. We have a synth petting zoo where you can go in and just, just check out everyone else's instrument. And we have some vendors come in, set up tables and sell their wares. So, it's a fun day all about electronic music. So performers, lectures, gear is everywhere. So that's a great fun day. That next one's April 4th. And I believe that the Boston Modular group will be back here February 22nd here at the Hearing Room.
On the Hearing Room. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks. It's been great. And Bob Familiar is who I've been talking to today. And I wanted to remind you that the Hearing Room is available at hearingroom.net, so you can find out more about all the information I've shared today with regard to membership, scheduling, so you can find out what events we have, and more information about volunteering, all that good stuff. I also want to thank Greenville Junction Shop. That's Greenville, JUNKTIONSHOPPE. Greenville Junction Shop is available on Facebook, and they have upcycled items that you can enjoy. So that's it for this episode, and you can listen in. On Thursday, we have Mark Mandeville and Rayanne Richards is the show I pre-recorded, and you can listen to that as you're digesting your turkey sandwiches, or your turkey, I guess. I guess it's Thursday, so you'll be getting the turkey sandwiches the next day and listening is my guess. But
Aaron, thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful holiday.
All right, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday too, Bob. And that's it. So listen in on Thursday. Have a great week.
If you start with a dream and share it with some friends, the idea deepens and grows. The dream takes shape, it has form and substance, and community soon arose. A listening room, the hearing room, a place to find a home to play. A listening room, the hearing room, express your